All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our research roundtable here at Seminary Ridge Museum virtually. This is our second research roundtable, our first done virtually, and we've got a great conversation to have this afternoon with Dr. Daryl Black of Seminary Ridge Museum and Dr. Chris Graham of the American Civil War Museum. My name is Pete Mealy. I work at Seminary Ridge Museum as the Director of Education and Chief Operating Officer, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. As we wait for people to come online, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing over the last month as Seminary Ridge Museum has been closed during this quarantine. We've been closed for about a month now, but we are engaging in a lot of digital content being provided both on Facebook and in other ways. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., we're having a special Facebook Live. This week, I'm going to be talking about the United States Signal Corps during the Battle of Gettysburg. The week after that, Dr. Daryl Black will be talking about pro-slavery theology. And we have these events scheduled at least through the end of May. On Friday, we have a special event for members. If you're a member of Seminary Ridge Museum, and if you're not, you can always become one, a special Zoom history happy hour with Dr. Black and myself, where we will be talking about July 1st, 1863. So we hope that you'll join us for some of those events during this time. If you're interested in becoming a member of Seminary Ridge Museum, we'll post the link to our membership page in the comments, and you can just go to our website and become a member or make a donation to help support the work that we're doing right now as the museum is closed. So the format of this program, we're going to have our two speakers speak for about 20 minutes each on their documents, and we have placed the documents in the comments section of this post. So if you'd like to follow along or reference these documents or read them during or after the program, just take a look down in the comments and click the link, and it will take you to where they are posted online. So they're going to each talk, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. I have a few questions that I've prepared, but we really want this to be something that the audience participates in. So we invite you to put your comments or your questions in the comment section of the Facebook page, the Facebook post, or you can email them to me, pmiele@seminaryridge.org, and I'll be compiling those questions throughout the program, and then we'll be asking them as we go through. We want to thank Sites Realty Incorporated in Gettysburg for supporting this program today. David Seitz is a great realtor, and he was gracious enough to help underwrite this program and underwrite all of our Research Roundtable programs. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Chris Graham of the American Civil War Museum, who's going to talk today. So Dr. Graham.
Hi. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for joining us. And thanks, Daryl and the Seminary Ridge Museum for inviting me to participate in this. And I really look forward to having this conversation. As a starting point, the thing I want to talk about is a document that was produced in Richmond, Virginia in March of 1863. And in that month, there was a convention. The document says there was a convention, though I can't find any newspaper references to it. But there was a convention that produced something called an address to Christians throughout the world. And it was signed on to by 99 of the Confederate States' leading clergy from every denomination, from Baptists and Methodists to Lutherans and German Reformed, and from every state from Virginia to Texas. And it was published in a variety of places. It was intended for an international audience, particularly of British Christians. And the point was to try to rally support for the Confederacy, if not actual material support, at least justification or validation that the cause was righteous. And they described how they understood the war to that point, and they described why they were writing at this particular moment. They said that the United States wasn't really interested in reunion or a return to the status quo antebellum. They were only interested in subjugation, and subjugation by violence at that. And they mention violence a lot, and they make some kind of vague passing references to the destructions that armies cause, but they don't really go into that because they got another violent instance that they want to talk about. And it's their only example of violence. And I'm going to quote here. They said, "Among all the indefensible acts grown out of the inexcusable war waged against us, we will refer to one especially. The recent proclamation of the President of the United States seeking the emancipation of slaves of the South is, in our judgment, a suitable occasion for solemn protest on the part of the people of God throughout the world." And so they're focusing on the Emancipation Proclamation. And Southerners do this in general, focuses on the Emancipation Proclamation, and they ridiculed abolitionists and other emancipationists. And they like doing it because it does a couple of things. One, they feel like it exposes Northerners as, quote, pretend humanitarians. And that is a term that you see a lot in this literature, pretend humanitarians, which is essentially the Civil War era version of dismissing someone as a social justice warrior. But also, they focus on the Emancipation Proclamation because, in their view, freedom for enslaved people would unleash bloody murder in the homes of all white Southerners. And they elaborated on that. They said, this is another quote here. They said, "We have no language to describe the bloody tragedy that would appall humanity. Christian sensibilities recoil from the vision of a struggle that would inevitably lead to the slaughter of tens of thousands of poor, diluted insurrectionists. Suppose their owners suffered. In the nature of things, the slaves would suffer infinitely more. Make it absolutely necessary for the public safety that the slaves be slaughtered, and he who should write the history of that event would record the darkest chapter of human woe yet written." And so, in short, what they're saying is that should enslaved people be incited to rebellion or freedom in general, that would simply encourage them to rise up and murder their white masters. And because of white supremacy and white superiority and white competence, white people would be forced to murder all the Black people in turn. And that's the crux of it. And this, to them, from their perspective, it's hopefully it seems outlandish to you. It does to me. But from their perspective, that's the reason why they're the real humanitarians and the real friends of Black people, and abolitionists and emancipationists were the actual enemies because they desired this end through their actions. So why are Christians concerned about this? Why are these ministers, these leading ministers in the Confederate South, concerned about the Emancipation Proclamation and frame it in this kind of apocalyptic way? To understand their logic, we have to kind of go back to the antebellum period and unpack a particular phrase, and that's pro-slavery Christianity. I trust some of you all have heard that one before, but pro-slavery Christianity was a body of theology and action that was developed by Southern evangelicals after the American Revolution. And there are kind of three main points when talking about what it was and what it did. And the first point is that pro-slavery Christians, evangelicals in the South particularly, searched the Bible for affirmation of slavery. And as religious historian Mark Knoll says, yeah, they found it. The Bible is firmly pro-slavery in the fact that slavery is all in the Old and New Testament. And there are very few, if no, anti-slavery passages that people could extract from it. But they weren't looking to just justify slavery by saying, look, it happened then too. They were interested in describing how slavery operated. What were the obligations between masters and the people they enslaved toward each other? Essentially, what's the most Christian way to practice slavery? And this biblical reading kind of the fact that they were able to root their justification for slavery in the way it was practiced was so thoroughly and successfully to them rooted in the Bible. They regarded themselves as the true Orthodox, conservative, Bible-believing Christians of the day, and regarded abolitionists, who many of them were evangelicals as well, as heretics, as having been inspired by the heresy of academic study of the Bible, or the heresy of emotion, and that they were the wrong ones. They were the liberals of the day. The second point about pro-slavery Christianity is that the Bible kind of reveals an application for Christian race relations, and kind of creates a theory of social relations that practitioners really attempted to work through in their practice of faith, but also aligned well with other theories of social relations, whether it's economic or political or cultural, that supported unequal race relations and white supremacy of the day. And it's basically this, that masters and enslaved people had obligations to each other, that masters had a Christian obligation to expose the humans they enslaved to Christianity and thereby to civilization. And in turn, enslaved people had an obligation to serve, be content in their service, and to willingly learn Christianity from white masters. And that slavery was the mechanism that made that possible. Without slavery, there would be no legal or religious kind of tool to bind the races together for this purpose that they claimed for it. And so what this does is I call it a kind of their what they regard as their sacred obligation. It's part of God's will, or part of God's plan, that that slavery is a process. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in God's plan, God brought Africans to America to be Christianized and civilized. This is, again, these pro-slavery Christians' view of it. And then the middle of the plan was that the Christianization and evangelization and civilization of Africans happen through slavery, and that someday, in God's own time, not man's, slavery could end. And so don't be confused by that. They fully determined that it would be up to God to end slavery, not man, and particularly not abolitionists, before the time was over. We do tend to get confused. And so one of the better known examples of white Christian Southerners praying for the end of slavery within the context of pro-slavery Christianity is Robert E. Lee, who prayed for the end of slavery, but he was praying for the fulfillment of God's plan that worked through the successful working of slavery, not for the abolition of slavery in that moment. And so this all creates kind of a narrative. This creates a narrative of racial difference here, in which you have competent, sanguine white people as tutors, and childlike and submissive and willingly submissive, but potentially dangerous Black people as their mentees, or whatever the word is. And this is a narrative of racial difference that, in their full imagination about it, had that potential for apocalyptic end if tinkered with by abolitionists. The dangerous childlike Black people would rise up and murder the civilized white people, and so this is actually a thing that moves into the future, because emancipation happens in 1865, but kind of this configuration of the role in relationship of white people and Black people for white Southerners continues well after the Civil War. The third thing about the pro-slavery Christianity is what the various denominations, and all of them did it in some way or another. Presbyterians and Baptists led the charge, but Methodists and Episcopalians and the smaller denominations had some element of this as well. They called it the mission to the slaves, or the mission to the colored people, which is how it's more commonly termed in their literature. And the mission to colored people consisted of publication of sermons designed specifically for enslaved people, the encouragement for lay people to get involved in the religious lives of enslaved people, to invite enslaved people into family worship in the homes of white people, for churches to raise money for evangelization to white people. And what that means in the kind of routine of annual sermons in ordinary Southern churches is that once or twice a year, the preacher would give a sermon that was devoted to raising these issues, saying it was their Christian cause to adhere to these doctrines and to raise money for it. And the biggest part of it, and the most well-known part of the mission of the slaves, was conducting Sunday schools for enslaved people and people of color. And that is also another thing that's often confused and easily confused when we see white Southerners teaching Sunday school to enslaved people, and it's often interpreted as essentially done out of love and an interest in the full kind of human flourishing of the enslaved people. Also to the point of calling it kind of a neo-abolitionist or proto-abolitionist, I should say. And it's Sunday schools, and the best known example of this probably for this audience is that Stonewall Jackson conducted a Sunday school for enslaved people in Lexington, Virginia. And yes, in the great Protestant tradition of literacy, there was many times reading involved and teaching to read involved, even if it was illegal. But this was not an abolitionist activity. This was an activity meant to ensure that slavery worked in the way that they understood that God had defined slavery. They really wanted to make slavery work in a way that was best for enslaved people, and more importantly, for white people, and being able to fulfill what they saw as an obligation that God had given them. Now, this is often the basis for kind of post-war, antebellum, wartime, and post-war claims that the people engaged in the mission to the colored people were good masters or Christian masters. And I do want to step outside this for a second and say that that's preposterous. There's no way under any circumstances or any justification that we can accept the idea of a good master in slavery. But what we do know is that the people practicing this believed it. They genuinely believed it. And they never took it as a transparent cover for greed. They never imagined it as a balm for a guilty conscience. They were thoroughly convinced of the orthodoxy and the intellectual soundness of their reasoning in this regard. So they weren't just kind of silly, mistaken, they didn't regard themselves as silly, mistaken, kind of misreaders of theology. They regarded abolitionists in that way. And they genuinely believed it, and they had thought it through and genuinely believed it. And they actually imagined, the white people involved imagined themselves as the martyrs in this cause, as they're the ones that have accepted this obligation from God to tutor unchristian and uncivilized Africans, and that it was a burden on them. And this is where, kind of getting back to Robert E. Lee's statements on it, when he said that slavery was undoubtedly an evil, on the continent, Alan Guelzo points this out, is what he's talking about is that it's an evil because of the burden it puts on white people. He doesn't, well, we don't need to get into that, but the Southern nationalists in the antebellum period and Confederates during the war are conscientious of the fact that they may seem a little out of step in their belief that slavery is the right way to organize social life. And this is what made them the true humanitarians and not the social justice warriors amongst Northern abolitionists. And so these are the stakes for these Confederate clergy in 1863, and they're telling the world, particularly British Christians, that to allow the destruction of slavery by abolitionist violence meant bloody murder in Southern homes. But perhaps worse for them, is that to allow destruction of slavery by abolitionist violence meant a subversion of God's will. And it meant an inability to fulfill the obligation that they imagined that they had to conduct slavery in a Christian fashion. I want to end with two notes and something of a conclusion. First of all, this was not an out of the ordinary address that these 99 ministers signed on to in March of 1863. This is common language that you see in pro-slavery Christian literature, but also a common appeal that was being made in the Confederacy at the time. And I think maybe, I don't know if Pete has posted it or not, but the Attorney General of Virginia, John Randolph Tucker, 3 months after this, in May of 1863, went to the Richmond YMCA and delivered an address that was remarkably similar in his appeal, in his justification of slavery and placing slavery central to the cause, in the ongoing cause of the Confederate States. The other thing is that, considering that their audience was British Christians, we kind of wonder how did British Christians react to this? And we do have one note that was published in the London Observer shortly after this address reached England, and it's a very long paragraph, but it says basically that this is an address that is it got the worst humanitarian tragedy wrapped up in the most smug and sanctimonious theology you can possibly imagine. And they concluded that, quote, "We would only add that we believe the Confederate clergy could have done nothing more likely to damage their own cause with the British public than to publish this address." The larger observation here is that thinking about where we are in the war, and I think we're going to talk about tests and stressors later on, but this is an address to Christians throughout the world, and Confederates had always been very interested in international opinion because they always imagined themselves as having a place at the international table. And at the beginning of the Civil War, they were very positive about what their contributions might be. They said, we have a free trade ideology that will fit in with the Western world. We have educated and elegant statesmen who can be diplomats. We have a economic base, kind of the production of raw materials, cotton particularly, and sugar and tobacco and whatnot, that fits into the emerging international kind of industrial order. And we have a constitutional democracy that fits with where everyone else is. And we know our slave system may be a little out of step, but it produces a extremely stable political world that can be relied on. Things aren't working out for Confederates in 1863. The Western world is not rushing to their defense, either materially or intellectually. And Confederates begin to kind of change their tune about what they're offering to the world by 1863. And they begin noticing, they're noticing other events, and they see things like Garibaldi's radicalism in Italy, and they see they see things like the abolitionists in England and the Republican Party in the North, and they also see autocrats acting in Europe. So what they regard as autocrats, Bismarck in Germany and the Tsar of Russia, are combining to crush an independence bid by Polish nationalists. And what they began telling the world is that we have a stable constitutional democracy, and this world is full of fearful things like abolitionists and autocrats like Lincoln and Garibaldi and the Tsar of Russia. And all those people interested, Britain particularly, in forming kind of a stable world order should look to us as one of the standard bearers of that. And we deserve kind of validation on that point. And this is a document that perfectly fits into that transition. And I see from the clock I may be about a minute or two over, so I'm going to turn it over to Daryl at this point.
All right, thank you, Chris. Great stuff. So I'm going to take a separate document. Was produced a few months after the one that Chris has been talking about, and it's a more practical document. It's a sermon that's delivered by John Jefferson de Yamper Renfro, who's the chaplain of the 10th Alabama, and it was delivered to Cadmus Wilcox's brigade in Anderson's division of Lee's army. And it was delivered on August 21st, 1863, as a part of a national fast day. Very important sermon, a sermon that was published for the camp press and circulated pretty extensively during the latter parts of 1863. But before we get to the document, which has plenty to dig into, I want to talk a little bit about the social context, the socio-military context of this document, and think a little bit about where the men who were listening to this sermon came from, the kind of society that they had grown up in Alabama in the 1840s and the 1850s. So let's talk about Renfro just for a couple of minutes, because he is an interesting character. He becomes a very important leader in the Alabama Baptist Church in the latter part of the 19th century. He's a very important post-war figure. Like I talked about earlier this week, these men who lead Lee's the religious efforts in Lee's army end up becoming very important leaders in the post-war South, continuing these cultural ideals. As Chris noted a while ago, that just the end of the war and the end of slavery doesn't end the pro-slavery theology, and it begins to transform itself. But certainly some of those core tenets are still involved, and you see people discussing this going forward into the 1880s, 1890s. So but that's another story. Maybe we can talk about that next week when I talk a little bit more about pro-slavery theology. But in any case, let's focus on Renfro for just a minute, and then we'll talk about the men that he was preaching to. Renfro was from Washington County, Georgia, in the Cotton Belt region of Georgia. He was born in 1830, and if you remember from the last time I talked about the chaplains, most of these guys were born between 1830, 1832, and 36. And so they're youngish guys, and they're men who are on the make. So Renfro is writing a little older than the average, but very much a part of that generation. This is certainly a generation of white Southern ministers who have grown up entirely suffused in this pro-slavery theology. It become the dominant way of understanding Christianity before they were born, and it was a very mature part of what the evangelical movement in the South, and then especially in the plantation districts, was all about. But Renfro did not come from a religious family, and his parents had resisted the revivals that swept Georgia in the late 1820s and early 1830s. They moved to Macon County, Alabama, and in the 1840s, and Renfro was baptized, likely against his parents' wishes. But Renfro was baptized in 1848, so he's 18 years old before he formally becomes a member of a Baptist church. So he's moving into territory that his own family was not in favor of. Interestingly, he had a couple of brothers who ended up being being ministers, Baptist ministers in Alabama as well. So, he starts after he's baptized. He started his ministerial training with a Baptist preacher. He did sort of an internship rather than the formal theological education that many other of Lee's chaplains perform. This is likely partly because of his social background. He is a poor man. He makes that case very strongly in the sermon. But he doesn't go to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He doesn't go over to Columbia to the Presbyterian Seminary. He studies with an experienced minister in Northeast Alabama. Renfro is a very talented speaker. He developed a reputation for being a powerful orator and preacher even before he's ordained in 1852. And through the 1850s, he pastored several congregations in Calhoun and Cherokee County, Alabama, the northeastern part of the state, up along the Georgia state line, the Coosa River Valley, if you're familiar with that area. And by 1857, he's been elevated to the pulpit at the large Baptist church in Talladega, Alabama, and continues to preach for some time after that. He's already become pretty involved in the Alabama Baptist Convention, and that's what he's doing when the war starts. He did not become a chaplain right off the bat. His brother, N.D. Renfro, joined the Army as a private and was then promoted to lieutenant. But Renfro, like many Baptists, did not think that the military chaplaincy was the correct way of communicating religious information to the soldiers and ministering to the soldiers. All sorts of problems with Army churches and things like that, but that's for another time. He did participate as an Army missionary early on and was circulating tracts, circulating religious literature in the Army. So he is involved through the first year and some months of the war. Things changed pretty dramatically for Renfro at the end of 1862. His brother, N.D., who's in the 5th Alabama Battalion, is killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And we know that this affected Renfro very, very deeply. He wrote a funeral sermon for his brother, and soon thereafter, towards the end of December 1862, goes and attaches himself as the chaplain of the 10th Alabama. And the 10th Alabama were from the counties up in the northeast part of the state. So these are the people that he had gone into the Army with the people that he had been ministering to in the years before the war. So probably inspired by his brother, but partly also inspired by greater efforts on the part of the Confederate government to bring chaplains into the Army. Renfro goes into the Army at the end of 1862 and immediately becomes a very important voice in the revivals that start in Lee's Army just after the Sharpsburg campaign, a little interrupted by the Fredericksburg campaign, but really pick up in the first months of 1863. He preaches widely. He preaches not just to the soldiers in Wilcox's brigade. He preaches to the soldiers in all of the Alabama brigades and regiments in Lee's Army. He evidently works pretty closely with J. William Jones. There's a fairly extensive correspondence between the two. So he's coordinating with some of the real leaders of the chaplain corps. It's not clear to me yet whether he was part of the Chaplains Association, but it's hard to imagine that he's not a leading voice in that movement, particularly given the closeness to Jones that had developed. So, in any case, the brigade that he joins is one of the earliest brigades of Alabama soldiers who were organized for the war, and they had by 1862, when he joins the regiment, joins the brigade, had developed a very, very strong reputation as being great fighters. They were in the 7 Days campaigns. They fought throughout the 1862 campaigns. They weren't heavily engaged at Manassas, but they were pretty stoutly engaged at the Battle of Sharpsburg. Then they're engaged again at Fredericksburg and take pretty serious casualties. By 1863, during the Chancellorsville campaign, Wilcox's brigade is the unit that is sent to blunt the 6th Corps' advance from Fredericksburg onto the rear of Lee's army. So these are really remarkably successful soldiers in Lee's army, and that has to be taken into consideration when we think about what happens. Because when the spring of 1863, the morale in the Army of Northern Virginia is sky high, and it is the belief broadly in the Army, and particularly in Wilcox's brigade. There's several diaries and reminiscences and letters that mention the sense that whatever's going to happen in Maryland or Pennsylvania is going to end the war, and we're going to end the war successfully. But let me back up a half a step before we get to that and talk about where these guys were from, because this is very important when thinking about the structure of the sermon and thinking about the ways that Renfro is talking to these men. And frankly, you couldn't have picked a better cross-section of white Alabama society than what is displayed in Wilcox's Alabama Brigade. Remember, Alabama is not settled by whites, and it doesn't become a state until 1819. Large chunks of Alabama had been Native American, Creek, and some Cherokee, some Choctaw influences in control through the 1820s and into the 1830s in the very northeastern part of the state with the Cherokee. So this is fairly for white settlers, new settled land, and there is a wide diversity of economic and social practice that you see across the state. So let's do it by regiment. Let's think about the 8th Alabama Regiment for just a second. They were organized in May of 1861 in Montgomery, and they came from the Western Black Belt, and they came from the plains down in southeast Alabama. These were some of the heaviest. Slaveholding districts or counties in the entire state of Alabama. Perry County had 65%, Dallas County 78% or 76%, Butler County 37%, Coosa 27%, and then the Mobile area had 32%. This is a very traditionally marching masters kind of regiment. The same can be said for the 9th Alabama. They were from the Tennessee River Valley counties, Limestone County, Lawrence County, Morgan and Lauderdale, and Jackson County. All counties clustered along the Tennessee River. They have a very specific experience, and their morale is very heavily influenced by some things that militarily happen in North Alabama. But we'll get to that in just a couple more minutes. The 10th Alabama is one of those exceptional regiments in that the counties from which they came had very low instances of slaveholding and low concentrations of enslaved people within those counties. This is the regiment that Renfro is formally attached to. These soldiers come from St. Clair County, 16% enslaved, Jefferson County 22, Shelby 28, Calhoun 20, Talladega 37, Calhoun 20, and DeKalb 7.9. So this is a very different geography. The Coosa River Valley has some large plantations, but by and large, this is hill country, kind of rough and tumble part of Alabama. The 11th Regiment was organized in Lynchburg, Virginia. Again, these are soldiers who come from the eastern or the western part of the state, and most of these are black belt companies, and only one company comes from a county with less than 32% enslaved populations. And that's one company from Fayette County. The 14th Alabama comes from Auburn. I know that there's some people out here who just said War Eagle, so that's cool. They came from the plains down around Auburn and Opelika. Medium-sized slaveholding down there at the time of the war, and so these are the sort of more of the middle class planters. You can still see those houses down there, the plantation houses in southeast Alabama. are not what you think about when you think of plantations. They're small, neat houses, but not the grand Greek revival styles that you typically see. So in any case, that's where these guys come from. Just to sum that up, over 30% of, overall 36% of the regiment's companies came from counties that had more than 50% enslaved persons within those counties. 70% of the companies came from counties with enslaved populations that are greater than 30%. This is most certainly a brigade. These are regiments and a brigade of marching masters. Only 30% came from counties with populations of less than 30%, and very, very few, only 14% came from counties that had enslaved populations of less than 20%. Politically, the regions that these guys came from had sent secessionist majorities to the Alabama legislature in 1861 when the referendum over secession was being debated. The other third of the companies came from counties where there had been fairly strong resistance to immediate secession. These would be especially the counties along the Tennessee River Valley. There's a lot of anti-secession or more conservative approaches to secession in that part of the state. So, and denominationally, you would not be surprised to know that half the counties had Baptist majorities and half the counties had Methodist majorities, and that's just the pattern in Alabama. It's split right down the middle. So that's a little bit about their background. Of course, the military history specific. 7 Days campaign. They're at the fore of all of Lee's fighting in 1862, and again, as I mentioned before, had developed a very strong reputation as being one of Lee's crack brigades, and that's what they had been doing, and they felt the success. They felt the string of victories or near victories over the course of the year before the Gettysburg campaign starts. And their morale is sky high, like much of Lee's army in general. So what happens? They get to Gettysburg. They don't fight on the first day. They end up being a part of the fighting on the second day around the Klingel Farm, down in the Plum Run Valley. They get down to the Plum Run, right next to gotten mixed up with Barksdale's brigade, and they're stopped. And there are two officers, the colonel of the 8th Alabama and then Wilcox himself, noted that we can see victory at the top of the ridge. They stopped, but they were waiting for the reserves to come up, and they felt like they were right on the verge of winning the war, and it was going to be over that afternoon. There are 3 accounts of soldiers mentioning that feeling down there in the Plum Run Valley, and then the desperation that they felt with no supports coming up. So within just a very few hours, they go from riding high to holy cow, this is not going to work. And the same experience unfolds the next day as they are sent in as something of an afterthought to the Confederate attack on July 3rd. They take serious casualties on both days, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% across the board for the brigade. So it's a confusing, mind-numbing, demoralizing experience that they have at Gettysburg. And there's a lot of demoralizing stuff going around throughout the Confederacy that Renfro addresses in his sermon that he delivers on the 21st of August. The sermon was given as a part of a fast day that was declared by Jefferson Davis, and then organized as through a General Order 83 that Robert E. Lee issues to order religious services and a day of fasting and supplication on August 21st. So that's the context. What's the text? It's a fascinating text, and as I said before, it was published. And this is why we know what Renfro said that day. It was the sermon. He sat down and wrote the sermon out and sent it out to the burgeoning religious press in Richmond, Virginia, and it's circulating probably in the Army by the end of September, if not earlier, as a very important statement of what the Confederacy and what the Confederate soldiers need to be doing. So What does he say? Well, he starts with his text. He chooses for his text, Second Chronicles, the story of Jehoshaphat, the story of Jehoshaphat's preparations for battle, his supplicant approach to asking for God's help, his admission of sins. It's a very powerful passage that ends with, the battle is not yours, the battle is God's. And that is the title of this sermon. The battle is God's. It's drawn straight from Second Chronicles. And throughout the entire sermon, Renfro draws very close parallels between Confederate leaders and Jehoshaphat and the army and the people of Judah. It's something of typological argument, though not in the strictly theological sense of typology. Typology is where there's something in the Old Testament prefigures something in the New Testament. It's a very specific theological move, and it's one that Calvinists especially, and people working in the Reformed tradition, refer to and use fairly commonly in the 19th century. It had typology has an up and down history in the history of theology in the Western churches. But in any case, the Baptists and the Presbyterians are certainly using typological reasoning and arguing. And this is what happens, and this is what Renfro is doing. He's reading Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis as pious leaders and the standing in for Jehoshaphat, and the soldiers are the citizens of the kingdom of Judah. It's just as simple as that. It's a very familiar, I grew up Baptist, and it's a very familiar kind of figuring. As I was reading this the first time, I thought, gosh, this sounds like the structure of this sounds like a lot of the sermons that I heard growing up. So it's still this way of reasoning is still one that's used by, or at least when I was 30 years, 40 years, good gracious, ago, still was a common way of thinking. So the sermon was also to be shared. This event was a shared event. The day of fasting was supposed to be across the Confederacy, and in fact, there are sermons, according to J. William Jones, the sermons were well attended. The sermons were very attentively heard, and they were very, very successful. So what is Renfro up to here? So what he does is he blends the individualistic, pietistic, holiness themes of Southern evangelicalism into this sermon, and he asks the soldiers to supplicate themselves, to pray, and to dedicate themselves to being better Christians. And this is how he puts it at the beginning of the sermon. He says, we need to acknowledge our dependence upon the arm of the Lord God for the success of our country's cause, and to implore his blessings upon the darkest hour of our national woe. And what he's doing here, what he begins to do here is to go back to some of the foundational ideas that you would have heard in sermons preached in 1861. These very nationalistic sermons, because we know that in the latter part of 1861 through the first part of, all the way through this period in August of 63, most of the preaching, most of the sermons that were published were about salvation. They were about saving souls. But there's a turn after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, after the Tullahoma campaign, back towards these nationalistic types of sermons and readings. So a very important shift in the ways that religion is being used in the armies. It's moving back to a more public space. But one of the things that's interesting is that Renfro breaks this sermon into several parts. One is this introduction, starts to read the typology, and then he moves into something that's very a series of questions that are very practical. And again, this is a very common Baptist type of sermon structure. There's a theory, there's a biblical text, and then there's an application. And what he is saying is that Jehoshaphat didn't fear, because Jehoshaphat knew that God was on his side, and Jehoshaphat trusted that the battle was not Jehoshaphat's, it was God's. And so what he does is he catalogs a series of fears that the Confederate Army was expressing, and at least the soldiers in Wilcox's brigade were addressing in the months after the Gettysburg campaign. So Fear is pervasive, he says, but we should not be afraid. He acknowledges right at the beginning of the sermon that there's a lot of scared soldiers and young men in this army right now, but we don't need to be afraid. And he blends biblical examples with calls to patriotism. He goes back to the argument: will we be freemen or will we be slaves? Something you had seen early on, but then he connects that to the Hebrews and the Egyptians. Again, he's reading this text very carefully and making an argument that the soldiers in Lee's army and the people of the Confederacy are God's chosen people. And this is a major theme that develops in the course of the war and then beyond in the lost cause. These soldiers were being read as God's chosen warriors, and the people of the Confederacy as God's chosen people. He goes into this argument about, he reminds the soldiers why they were fighting, why was separation necessary. We didn't start the war. We just wanted to be left alone. We tried to go in peace. He uses a biblical allusion there, but we had to fight because they wouldn't allow us to go in peace. And they are dedicated to the cause. And as he puts it, he talks about how the Wilcox's brigade is one of the best brigades in the Army. He says you have to fight on, and he's encouraging these soldiers to fight on very specifically. At least 3 times he says we have to fight on. We got to hold on. We got to keep doing this. Very repetitive rhetorical device at very critical moments. He makes the argument. He said, "Don't be afraid of the North's superior numbers." He uses the Bible and he uses history to show that the weaker force more oftentimes than not, he claims, ends up winning. The victory is given to the armies across history, and he says that the God who helped Jehoshaphat and his host win against great odds is the same God that the Confederacy fights with. Very, very powerful connections being made between the Confederate cause and God's cause. Goes back to some of the things that Chris was saying earlier on, this vision of this larger society and this larger participation in the international world. But that's something we can talk about in the Q&A later on. So there are a couple of times in this sermon where it almost seems like Renfro turns to a very specific audience. Some of this is general to all of the guys and it has general application. On 2 occasions at least, he turned. I could almost see him turning to where the guys from the 9th Alabama were sitting and talking about the cruel enemy who's destroyed their homes, has burned their churches. He says, do I hear you say your mothers, sisters, wives, and children have been insulted and imprisoned, wronged and oppressed, or threatened with these evils? Then hear the stirring words of God's holy prophet. Be ye not afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible. And fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your house. Here's patriotism and here's religion. And here in the South, and he in the South who does not sympathize with this spirit is the enemy of God and his own posterity. Why is that specifically resonant for the soldiers of the 9th Alabama? Well, the soldiers of the 9th Alabama's families had been visited with exactly these same kinds of things that are in the biblical text. The Union Army arrives in that part of Alabama in the spring of 1862, just after the Battle of Shiloh. It is an area with ugly guerrilla warfare, towns being burned. Turchin's brigade burns, Turchin's brigade burns Athens, Alabama in 1862. There are troops across. Buell's army marches across through North Alabama in 1862, trying to get to Chattanooga. It is an area that has been visited very specifically by war and very specifically with the kinds of turnings out that this biblical text addresses. So he goes on for a little bit about that, but he doesn't belabor the point, but it's very, very pointed and it's very, very clear that those soldiers whose families were asking for them to come home, perhaps, encouraging them to choose their families over their military service, were being specifically addressed. And I think very much the 9th Alabama was being singled out here. He makes the claim that the military situation isn't that bad. We're being tested by God. Our cause is just, And the Lord is proving our confidence in him and our country's cause. This is a test. This is a test to see how much we want this and to how to show us how dedicated we are to this cause. The disasters at Vicksburg and Gettysburg weren't that bad, he says. He said, you were at Gettysburg and you know that the Union Army had to go to those mountain fortresses to beat you. Every time we fought on a fair field, we've been victorious and we'll be victorious again. He said, and, don't worry about Vicksburg. Everybody knew in the spring of 1862, that when New Orleans fell, the Mississippi River didn't mean anything. He diminishes in the most absurd kinds of ways two of the greatest disasters that befell the Confederacy. He mentions others. He mentions the Union naval bombardments of Charleston, South Carolina, the appearance of the U.S. naval fleet next to Mobile. He talks about Bragg's army falling back, and it's getting worse. The day that this sermon is being given, perhaps even while Renfro is talking, there's a sermon that's being given in the First Presbyterian Church in Chattanooga that's still held by the Confederates. And dozens of high-level Confederate officers are in the First Presbyterian Church when Eli Lilly's artillery battery begins to bombard the city, sending the congregation fleeing back to their commands. And within 2 weeks, Chattanooga is gone. So even while these disasters are being minimized, further disasters are befalling the Confederacy. It's an interesting combination there. He talks a little bit about the fear of the people being afraid that they hadn't been recognized by the international community. That people are fearful for the suffering that's going on in the home and in the army. And then it seems like he turns to his comrades in the 10th Alabama, and there's a fear. He says that I've heard it said that this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. He uses exactly those words. And he says, look, I understand it. The poor are suffering. The poor are suffering in this war. He said, but the poor suffer anyway. That's the biblical lot of the poor, is to suffer, and to suffer patiently. And he said, but the rich people are suffering too. So we're all suffering together. And so he goes, let's go back to this quote. He says, it's sometimes alleged that this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I ask, are not the rich and the poor liberally represented here today? Oh, but there are so many rich men at home. Yes, and there are many poor men at home. The rich man has shirked his country's call by the power of money. Some of the poor have shirked the same call by skulking into the mountains. They are all alike dishonorable. And then he continues and turns into a very important part of this sermon. And it begins to help us understand some important questions about why poor white Southern non-slaveholders supported the Confederacy. And Renfro says, I contend, however, that the poor of our country have more reason to desire Southern independence than the rich. I speak it too as the representative of the poor. I'm a poor man myself, and if I ever had a wealthy relative, I never heard of him. I stand before you to represent my own offspring and many orphan relatives, and I urge most earnestly that I have more interest in this war, more at stake, than any rich man can have. The rich man's property is at stake, while the freedom of my children and children's children is involved in the issue. I never owned a slave in my life, and yet I contend that I have more interest in the institution of slavery than the man who owns 500. Abolish the institution of slavery, and your children and my children must take the place of that institution. Abolish that institution, as is the design of our enemies, and in less than half a century, the poor of the land must become the carriage drivers, body servants, waiting maids, and tenants of the rich. Theology melds with the mudsill theory. It melds with the notion of white supremacy, all together in this powerful passage. He continues, he makes the point even more pointed. You may say that the poor would not submit to this. And this would be to being the waiting servants. He says, but the capital of the rich man would be converted into land with emancipation. They would own the land of the entire country. The poor man has to live somewhere, and he must have something upon which to subsist. He cannot live on air. Sheer necessity would drive him to gladly accept the tenancy and the employment of the rich. And if this happens, he asked the soldiers rhetorically, I ask you soldiers to contemplate first the subjugation of your country and the abolition of slavery, and then look down towards down through a few generations, and behold your worthy offspring grinding in a factory, scouring a tavern, tilling the soil of the wealthy, and blacking the boots of the dandy. And then tell me whether the poor men have anything to fight for. In our country, he says, color is the distinction of classes, the only real distinction. Here, the rich man and the poor man and their families are equals in every important respect. The poor, if they do their duty, are as free and as independent as the rich. Slavery serves the interests of all white people in the South, according to Renfro. And this is a foundational concept of the pro-slavery theology, that it binds people together across social status, social class. Class equals race in the South. So he finishes this powerful passage, and it goes on for about 2 pages of 27. And he goes back, then he moves back to the biblical and typological argument. He gives a long quote from Lee's General Order 83 about the individual sin and how we must ask for forgiveness and how we must supplicate ourselves before God. He shows more examples. He shows a very specific example of how the soldier should follow Lee's instructions. Basically, he says, follow what Jehoshaphat says. And he goes right through so he's figured Lee, and then a little bit later in the same section, Davis as Jehoshaphat. And he says, follow these legions. You can see Robert E. Lee has done this. You can see Jefferson Davis has done this. Ask for forgiveness of your sins. Acknowledge the sins of our individual selves and our overdependence on our own power, and give it all back to God, and we will be successful. He comes to his conclusion, and he says that he comes back to this thing that the battle is not theirs, but it is God's. We need to be deeply convinced the battle is not ours, that we need to purify ourselves, he says. We need to pray. We need to stop sinning. We need to be converted. The individual expressions of religion will then build up a more moral and a more Christian society, and God will then smile on you. But right now, we've depended too much on our own selves. He says we need to be deeply convinced that the battle is not ours, but God's. God has always fought the battle of liberty. He was the God of the armies of Israel. He battled for these people in the most remote ages, and when he marshaled them, they always waxed valiant in the fight and escaped the edge of the sword and put to flight the enemies, the armies of the aliens. It's a fascinating document, and I think it opens up some really interesting views on the everyday applications of the pro-slavery theology. And I think it tells us a few things. The first is something of a historiographical issue. In reading the sermon, I've read it more than a few times. It is clear that the morale crisis of the late summer of 1863 was absolutely real in Robert E. Lee's army. There's no doubt about the ways that Renfro is addressing this, and then again, the fact that the document is printed and circulated within the army. And it's a real crisis that had to be met. And religious leaders are fundamental in meeting this. There's a great revival. One of the biggest periods, or the strongest periods of revival comes after the fast day in 1863. Second, the cultural and economic fundamentals of the Old South in the new Confederacy had to be rearticulated. There had to be a reminding of what was going on and what God's will was and where these people stood within God's will. And they had to be reminded of this. Third, some of those themes of the lost cause that we talk about so often were already being played out during the war, especially the sacralization of Lee and Davis. And it's a remarkable transition, taking these men and putting them into the Bible as Old Testament patriarchs. And they're cast in that way during the war, and then become even more so cast in that role after the war is over. Fourth, the individualistic, conversion-centric, holiness-centric nature of antebellum religion. It's the whole foundation. It's conversion, individual purity. All of those ideas were being called on in the service of the Confederate nation. If we are holier people, we will be blessed. Fifth, the centrality of slavery as a system that bound all whites was laid bare. in this sermon, and the relationship between class elevation and race was made perfectly clear. This significantly, I think, helps us to begin to understand how the Confederate experience unfolded and how central slavery was, both as a theological concept, a social concept, and a political concept to whites of all social classes in the Old South and in the Confederate experience. So that's what I've got. I hope we have some questions that come up. This is dense stuff. So Pete, I think I see you coming back on.
Yep. So thank you both. Thank you all for joining us again. We're talking about Confederate religion with Dr. Daryl Black and Dr. Chris Graham. We do have a few questions, or at least one question that I want to bring up from the comments. But we have a lot of people watching and checking in from all different parts of the country. But one of the questions that just came in kind of right here at the end of Daryl's talk, which I think is a good way of kind of segueing into these questions, is how did Southern preachers alter their messages and sermons during the Reconstruction era and in the following decades?
Chris, you want to take a stab at that, or you want me to get to it?
Well, what I've noticed in regards to kind of the central theme of mine, and that's pro-slavery Christianity, is that they acknowledge the end of slavery as a legal institution, and they put that at the hands both of Providence and at the hands of Yankee bayonets.
Yeah.
Kind of hand in hand, so to speak. And so they say, well, we have to accept this, and that's fine. But and so that changes, and so they kind of end this defense of the institution of slavery. But what they do, at least in the ones that I've studied, in the immediate post-war period and for about 5 years after, is that they continue to insist that there's this sacred obligation between white people and black people, that they really coming out of slavery want to double down on this. And so, for instance, the Diocese of Virginia in 1866 begins to set up kind of departments in the diocese that replicate almost word for word the mission to the colored people that they had set up in the late 1850s. The only difference was that they added schools to the programs. And they insisted in sermons, and particularly Bishop John Johns of the Diocese of Virginia delivers several sermons in which he insists that despite the end of slavery, that black people and white people still need to be bound together in these close, what he regarded as sacred relationships. What's interesting to me is that they maintain this interest in, this may be different elsewhere, but they maintain this interest for about 5 years, and in the denominational literature, it just kind of disappears. They stop caring, and they move on to other ways of kind of expressing racial relationships in a church context, but this sacred obligation kind of disappears from the imperative of churches that are kind of teaching their congregants to fulfill their obligation to God by fulfilling these sacred relationships.
One of the things that happens is that the sermons that are being preached that are trying to re-articulate and reshape this sacred obligation, black members of the churches refuse to acknowledge it. They vote with their feet. Remember that the vast majority of evangelical churches in the South before the Civil War were biracial. That blacks and whites worship together. The kinds of sermons that Chris was talking about a while ago that specifically address those obligations came on a regular basis, and you can see examples of that in everyday preaching as well. But by 1870, most of these biracial churches have divided, and the Southern clergy are absolutely bumfuzzled by it. They don't get it. They don't understand why their black brothers and sisters don't want to be in this dependent relationship anymore. and they try to re-articulate some of the controls that had existed before the war was over, or before the war, with white oversight of the churches. But Black Baptists and Black Methodists and Black Presbyterians weren't having any of it, and they struck off, and they created incredibly important institutions of their own. So after 1870 or so, the churches had been made physically separate in a way that they had never been before, and the theologies begin to diverge. There's the rejection, whether they say it out loud or not, the rejection of that paternalism seems to result in, well, you know what, there's nothing, we have to go in another direction with this. And I think that's what Chris is pointing out really, really well, that they take on, they use different kinds of reasoning as you get into the 1880s and 1890s. I think that comes out of the fact that the Black Baptists, the Black Christians had completely rejected any of this notion of subjugation within the church and these social imperatives.
Yeah, there's one thing that is kind of missing from kind of the perspective we're arguing from, and that's from the white pro-slavery Christians, is what is the perspective of African Americans in the South, enslaved or otherwise, toward this. And it's often difficult to discern because, truth telling is not one of the tools that they have. But one of my favorite quotes is from Frederick Douglass, who, I don't remember the exact quote, but he was reviewing a volume of pro-slavery sermons that was published in the early 1850s, and he referred to them as evangelical flogging. So he was specifically talking about Richmond and Richmond Episcopalians, and referred to the slave trade out of Shockoe Bottom, but he called it evangelical flogging. That might give you some insight onto what was being thought on the ground here in the South.
Yeah, the WPA slave narratives give us a little bit of insight in the way that even in the antebellum period, these attempts at creating the shared Christian world, you read a lot of resistance on the part of the enslaved people who were able in the 1930s tell stories of being in these churches when these kinds of sermons were being given, and even before the war is over or before the war begins, there's a lot of sure. Kind of things going on with the enslaved communities and the free blacks who are in those churches. There's already a general rejection of that paternalism before the war.
Great. Keep coming with the questions as they come up. You can comment in the comment section underneath the video. One of my questions is, throughout the Daryl's presentation, he's talking a lot about the morale of the Confederacy in May, June, and then kind of the bottom falling out in July. I was wondering if you could both comment a little bit about what's going on in other parts of the Confederacy during the time when these two documents are being presented, Chris's document in Richmond and Daryl's in Orange Courthouse, Virginia. What's happening in the Western Confederate armies? What's happening in other cities in the Confederacy that might have some bearing on kind of the breadth of this movement?
I think Daryl can probably speak to the military situation a bit better than I can, especially out west. But what's happening on the Confederate home front is that the spring of 1863 is really that period where the terrible losses in the sheer number of dead men from the previous summer was really becoming apparent in terms of what that means for household and what that means for families. It's also the period where the restriction on kind of the supply of material resources throughout the Confederacy is also coming into sharp relief. And what I mean by that is food shortages and inflation. And what this culminates in is a series of bread riots in places like Mobile, Alabama, and Richmond, Virginia, and Salisbury, North Carolina.
There's some in Atlanta, Georgia. The women who work in the arsenal go on strike. A lot of unrest. So, yeah.
And it's really it's really kind of a shock to the system, particularly for a nation that says that says we really have our social situation figured out, and where there's no real discontent amongst white people. And all of a sudden, the spring of 1863, there's all this discontent amongst white people. And so I think that's that, combined with the favorable reviews of the Emancipation Proclamation from Britain, kind of inspires the address that I gave. But what's interesting to me is that the civilian population of the Confederacy is kind of shuddering for the first time in a ways that the Army at that moment is not. And so that's a transition to you, Daryl.
The military situation in the West is, in April, things are pretty okay. The first attempt to capture Vicksburg had failed. The Army of Tennessee had reoccupied Middle Tennessee. Lee's army had fought a great battle at Fredericksburg. So morale is pretty high. But when you start thinking about, there's a parallel round of revivals that's going on in Bragg's army, in the Army of Tennessee. We know that. Larry Daniel has written about that very nicely, very recently. They're the same kinds of appeals. But the thing I think is different between Lee's army and Bragg's army, as far as those appeals go, is Bragg's army had been terribly unsuccessful, and Lee's army had been very successful by and large. So the exhortations to keep fighting are a little bit harder for the Army of Tennessee guys to bear. But still, it's a very similar kind of sermonizing that's going on, and attempts at promoting revival. So we'll be digging into that later on as we go into thinking about the real differences between Bragg's army and Lee's army as far as religion, because the socioeconomic backgrounds. A lot of the guys who are in the Army of Tennessee are very different than Lee's army, especially as you get deeper into the war. So, there's the everyday sermons keep going on, the everyday revival activity keeps going on. So I think that kind of gets sort of at the question, Pete, if you want to follow up on that, or you.
No, that kind of answered what I had. The other question that I had was sort of what's the effect? Is there any way to gauge the effect of these two documents? What they do for the purposes that they've been written or presented.
I haven't. Well, this is my way of saying I haven't researched its reception amongst Confederates all that much. Where it does show up, people talking about it, is in England and in the United States, which, as you might expect, both locations roundly mock and criticize it.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say on an individual level how Renfro's sermon worked. It's the proof is kind of, I think, in the pudding of what happens with Wilcox's brigade. And if you want to take this as an exhortation to keep fighting, well, they keep fighting, and they maintain very high military efficiency. They are at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania. They are really heavily engaged in the Overland campaign. They are stalwarts, and whether or not his sermon specifically convinced a big bunch of that brigade to stay along is hard to say. Like I said, I think that the activities suggest that it did have some sort of success. J. William Jones said that the fast day sermons were all very well received, and that they were very I think it was uplifting moments. So there's still reception theory and consumption theory is very difficult to get at. And even if you have a couple of documents that say, hey, we really liked that sermon, that was a great sermon, we really got excited about it. Again, that's only speaking for one or two or three people at most, and
sure.
It's difficult to get at. The important thing is that I think that Renfro thought that these were the salient issues that needed to be brought up and that they would resonate with people. Because again, most of the sermon is practical. There's not a whole lot of high-level theology. Certainly, this typological insertion of Confederates into the Old Testament is profoundly theological. But most of what he's talking about is everyday kinds of concerns and trying to address all of those fears that he is seeing in the camps in the 2 months after Gettysburg, month and a half after Gettysburg.
And Daryl, I'm remembering this off the top of my head because it's been a while since I read it, but if correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember from Chandra Manning's What This Cruel War Was Over, is that she finds that Confederates, particularly in the Army of Northern Virginia, that are justifying staying with the Army in the later part of 1864 when things are really bad, they do articulate that kind of the abolitionist tendencies, the emancipationist tendencies, the attack on slavery was kind of symbolic of the larger violence that the United States Army was attempting on the South, and one of the only ones. And so they, I believe that she tracks that they were articulating kind of this, we have to stay at it because look what they're doing with slavery. Yeah.
There are even examples in Bragg's army of the same kinds of attitudes, and certainly I think that Renfro's sermon put everything back and put the entire experience of 1862 and 63 into summative form, and said, look, this war is not over. There are plenty of examples of God making the enemies flee. I mean, it's interesting. He makes an argument that one of the practical arguments he makes is that the disparity in numbers is not that great, and it can't get that great because the enslaved people of the South are doing all the productive and support work, and in the North you have to have white farmers doing that same kind of work. So he's saying that we can marshal a higher percentage of our population than the North can, which of course he's still not taking into consideration the recruitment of African American soldiers and things that are going on in Tennessee and Mississippi and South Carolina right at the same period that he's writing, with the recruitment of African American soldiers, and so the numbers, it's by the end of the war 190 some odd thousand former enslaved people are fighting against the Confederacy, which it completely upturns his whole math and his whole logic of how Lee can hold on.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's amazing to me that what they do see that affirms what they already believe and what they choose not to see that would turn it over. Turn it over in terms of, they're kind of framing this as saying, look what the Republican abolitionists are doing to slavery and to us in the South. This only proves everything we said about them since 1854. Yeah. Right. But what they're not seeing is that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were escaping and not murdering their white masters. Right. And they're going to refugee camps, and the first thing they're learning how to do is get Christianity on their own terms and get education on their own terms and be political actors on their own terms, and joining the military on their own terms. And it's they just don't. It's there. They're just not seeing it. Yeah. They're choosing not to see it, I think. But
go ahead.
These are polemics. These are intended to be polemics to urge on a cause rather than to be think pieces.
One of the questions Carol just asked: by the end of the war, how did Southerners explain that God was not on their side?
They had sinned too much. And that what they had to do in the post-war world was to sanctify and purify themselves, not their society. This was condemnation of the people of the South for their sins and for their crimes against God and for depending. There's a lot of talk about extortion and people making huge profits and how evil that is and how that undermined the cause. And see, if we hadn't have done that, then we'd have been all right, and God wouldn't have punished us. But see, and it's funny because Renfro's talking about that whole, and Lee writes about that in his general order. I mean, this is 1863, and they're already talking about these issues that become parts of the lost cause. You know, the lost cause religion is all about getting better, and we've been chastened by God, and they think that it's their obligation to become better Christians, and then God will again smile on the South.
Right, and what I see is they do put it in kind of those providential terms, as chastening, but as Daryl mentioned, it's chastening for, we had too many speculators and extortioners in the Confederacy, or we idolized Stonewall Jackson too much and not God, and therefore we paid for that. But one thing at the core is they never say, were we wrong about anything. They'll spend the post-war years saying, well, God decided against us, but we were, even though we were morally correct. And you see that coming out of both the sermon and the address, in which they say, we may lose this. We may be subject to all kinds of violence and subjugation at the hands of Republican abolitionists, but we're still right. And one thing about the address that kind of the core of it that carries over into kind of their post-war lost cause thinking is that they're not asking for British intervention. They're just asking for British Christians to validate their point of view. And so to some degree, if they lost or not, materially almost didn't seem to matter. They wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they were morally correct in their stand. So, and that never went away after the war.
Included on that list of ministers, by the way, who signed on to this document is a Gettysburg graduate, graduated from the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary. In fact, the only Lutheran signatory to the document was a Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary graduate.
Another one was William White, who was the minister at Stonewall Jackson's Presbyterian Church that oversaw the Sunday school. Yeah,
there's a who's who. That the list is a who's who. Basil Manley, all of these guys that you said. Bishop Andrew, the guy who's over whom the Baptist or the Methodist split centered. It's the big dogs who sign on to that thing. It's the real.
Louis Dabney's on there. Benjamin Morgan.
Yep.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, my final question to both of you is, what research as people who are studying this topic and researching these documents, sort of what's the next step? What more would you like to? What questions do you still have? What more would you still like to find out? What do you intend to do from here with these two documents?
I have kind of 2 points on that, and Daryl can interject and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been a kind of a historiographical wave of studying Confederate religion and putting a lot of explanatory power on providence, on what's happening is that these guys are always trying to find a way to affirm that God is doing the right thing in the way things are turning. What I see and what I'd like to see more of in kind of analysis and description of these types of documents is what is the material factors that's going on here? What are the human factors? How are these being integrated with social theory and economic theory and labor theory and political theory and constitutional theory? Because their religious thought is lining up very well with, essentially man-made theories. And I think one value to me on that is that when it regards slavery, and this is kind of my second point, is that I don't know that and this is not a kind of an academic pursuit, maybe more of a public history situation, but I don't know that we really explain. We get to the point where we say slavery causes civil war. You can look at the Cornerstone speech. You can look at the Mississippi Declaration. It says slavery. therefore the end, case closed. But what these documents tell me and help me explain is, like, yeah, what happens after that? Why do the vast majority of Southern white people kind of mobilize themselves on behalf of a slaveholding republic? Because what I'm seeing here is that there's a religious theory, there's a social, again, there's all these theories that add up to a worldview of, why does it matter to me as a slaveholder, as a non-slaveholder, as a Tidewater resident, as a Mountain Valley resident, as a Christian, as a not a Christian, that would make me want to act on behalf of a nation that has this worldview. It's integral to every other reason for supporting the Confederacy. And I'd like to see kind of deep dives into these types of documents that kind of go further in explaining what this is all about, beyond saying, well, Alexander Stephens said it was slavery, therefore the end.
Yeah, the social and the cultural context, the worldview, absolutely are the issues that have to be pursued here, because the practice of religion in most of these new studies is kind of taken as fact. But there was a very specific social context in which this developed. There are theologies that are at odds that are involved here. So understanding how these really high ideals got translated into practical types of instruction or guidance. Certainly, you have to look to the pre-war world to understand that. So, a really subtle understanding of how pro-slavery functioned in the churches themselves, and how those sermons became a part of this worldview. But I think Chris is exactly right. This whole notion of siloing economic, political, religious is kind of pointless. Renfro's document itself shows this very, very clearly. And I've read a lot of siloed sermons that are very much about conversion, and that's fine and that's good. But when you get into there are certain periods of Confederate preaching in which these foundational ideas are rearticulated. In the case of Renfro, I believe that people are reminded of what is at stake, and we need to read those carefully. We need to read the conversion sermons closely and understand what the nature of conversion was, and how these guys saw social order coming out of the military experience, because there's a huge preponderance of evidence that the leadership, Renfro included, thought that Christian soldiers made the best soldiers, and that the Army was a great mission field. So understanding how that functions is a socially binding relationship, and taking seriously the logic of the pro-slavery theology. To simply say it existed and it was bad it's the first good step. But how do you understand how people can convince themselves or be convinced or live within a social and cultural context that seems to be, by all the evidence around it, way out of step, and very contradictory to other portions of the Bible? How does this cognitive dissonance work as a cultural system? So thinking about a cultural system that combines the religious, the political, the socioeconomic. And that's what I'm trying to do, by looking at who these guys were, and trying to figure out what was going on in the churches that they came from, and what were the dominant theologies, and what were the practices. You don't have to get too far outside of the Cotton Belt to see very or slightly different expressions of evangelicalism. The pro-slavery don't wash in Jackson County, Georgia. Once you get up above the plantation belt and start moving towards the mountains, and Chris is nodding his head because he knows a lot about North Carolina, these theologies are different. How did this? There's a lot of competition. There's theological competition, but at least in the slaveholding districts, and again, that's where Lee's Army by and large comes from. In those plantation districts, there is a overarching adherence to a very robust pro-slavery theology. But that's not how it is in the mountains of Lincoln County, Tennessee, and other places where slave labor is not or the labor of enslaved people is not the central mode of production. I mean, Renfro kind of gets on the Calhounian marks of the middle class stuff in portions of the sermon when he's explaining how labor works and how the value of labor in the South is greater than anywhere else in the world because of slavery. It's really fascinating stuff. So, but he's combining it in these sermons. He's combining all of these, these social expectations, these cultural expectations, these economic anxieties, these economic desires, very, very clearly. So that's what this, thinking about the ways that these ideas interpenetrate other areas that have heretofore been fairly siloed.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us, and thank you everyone on who tuned in on Facebook for joining us this afternoon for this event. We have Dr. Daryl Black from Seminary Ridge Museum, Dr. Chris Graham from the American Civil War Museum. I'm Pete Mealy, Seminary Ridge Museum. Do you have any final words to say?
No, I think I'm about
everybody's about talked out.
Yeah, about talked out. So
yeah,
a lot of fun, and I think that there's some important avenues. And those of you who are pursuing graduate studies, there's some great themes that still need some very careful exploring, because it's not only do these pursuing these ideas in this way help us understand the Confederate experience, but also the post-war experience, and then the theologies and the social practices that persist into the first part of the 20th century. Don't ever forget that the same guys who are preaching sermons in Confederate camps end up being the denominational leaders through the end of the 19th century and some into the 20th century. They train a whole generation, almost two generations of students and parishioners. So it's a very, very long, this pro-slavery theology as it adjusts has a very long history and cast a very long shadow well into the 20th century.
Great. Don't forget to join us this Tuesday for our 2 p.m. Facebook Live on the United States Signal Corps. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m. we'll be presenting a different Facebook Live. On Friday afternoon, Friday evening at 5 p.m., we have a special Zoom program for members. So if you're a member of Seminary Ridge Museum, come and join Daryl and myself for a look at July 1st, 1863. If you're not a member, head over to our website and you can join. We want to thank Sites Realty Incorporated here in Gettysburg for helping to underwrite these research roundtable programs. Our next one is going to be in November, hopefully in person. If not, we're going to do another digital one. Hilda Kuntz is going to be talking about mental health issues after the Civil War. I'm going to be presenting on the opioid crisis that grips the country in the wake of the Civil War and makes some ties to the present day. So we'll have more information on that as the time gets closer. You can always check our events page on our website to see what's coming up, both virtually and, again, hopefully on site in the near future. But once again, thanks for joining us today. We'll get through some of the Facebook comments, some of the questions that maybe need a little bit more explanation. We'll go through and address those in the period after. So once again, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And I hope to see you at our next program.